Colonel Lloyd H. Watnee Sr. was one of the finest examples of those proud Americans we often call the greatest generation. He was a pioneer in aviation and communications, whose service in World War II was essential to the preservation of our nation. His leadership set a high standard of excellence and demonstrated the virtues of service before self, virtues to which all of today's cyber warriors aspire. In 1901, Colonel Watnee was born in the small mining town of Caslow, British Columbia, to Norwegian immigrant parents Michael and Anna Watnee. The family moved to a larger Norwegian-American community in Portland, Oregon, where his father, Mike, was a self-employed house painter. Lloyd graduated from high school in 1919, and it seemed he was primed to take over his father's successful house painting business. But Colonel Watnee had his sights set on a higher calling. He wanted to fly. Since the Air Force was not yet in existence, he and two of his friends enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1927, taking the first step on a journey that would lead to a long and distinguished career, initially in the Army and later in the United States Air Force when it became a separate service. A year after enlistment, Cadet Watnee was admitted to flight school. He excelled in flight training. And upon graduation from flight school on June 22, 1929, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant and began his service as unit officer and flight leader at Marchfield, California. In early 1930, Lieutenant Watnee met Ruth Osborne while he was stationed at Mather Field, California. It was love at first sight, and they were married very soon thereafter. With his feet on the ground but his head literally in the clouds, Lieutenant Watnee was reassigned to Randolph Field, Texas, as a flying instructor in September 1931. He took great pleasure at seeing new pilots marvel at the wonder of flight. Although his love of flying remained intense, he attended the Air Corps Communications School from October 1932 until 1933 and found that his interests had changed from flying to radio. However, upon graduation from comm school, he was returned to the cockpit by way of Marchfield, California, to serve as operations officer of the 9th Bomb Squadron. When President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6591, suspending commercial airmail contracts and transferring the airmail mission to the Army Air Corps, Second Lieutenant Watnee became the Assistant Chief of the Army Air Corps Mail Operations Mission, operating from Salt Lake City, Utah. When the mail routes were returned to private contractors, Watnee was promoted to First Lieutenant and returned to California as Group Communications Officer at March and Hamilton Fields. In 1937, First Lieutenant Watnee became the Communications Officer at Barksdale Field, Louisiana. With the activation of the Army Airways Communication System in November 1938, he became the first commander of the 3 AACS region. He developed a network of 13 radio stations from points east in Alabama to points west in Arizona and points north in Kansas. He quickly established such a fine reputation for building efficient comm networks that he was promoted to captain in 1939. In July 1940, Captain Watnee was assigned to Albrook Field in the Panama Canal Zone to establish an AACS unit. Using the existing Panama net as nucleus, he developed the Caribbean Airways system with stations in Puerto Rico and Lend-Lease bases in the West Indies. He commanded the entire Caribbean network, which became essential to safe aircraft operations throughout the region. From April 1941 to June 1942, Watnee rose in rank from major to full colonel while growing and maturing the AACS system. In early 1943, Colonel Watnee moved the AACS operations to Bowling Field, Washington, D.C., where it was changed from a system to an organization called the Army Airways Communications System Wing, and he was made first commander of AACS. Unfortunately, he contracted a tropical illness while conducting an AACS inspection tour of the China-Burma-India Theater in November of 1943. He was hospitalized in India for several months before returning to active duty. His communications career then came to an end as the escalating battles of World War II summoned him back to flight duties. In December 1943, Colonel Watnee assumed command of the 490th Bombardment Group, Heavy, and trained for combat with B-24s while stationed at Mountain Home Field, Idaho. In April 1944, as D-Day approached, the group moved to England for operations with the 8th Air Force. As part of the 3rd Bombardment Division under the command of the legendary General Curtis E. LeMay, Colonel Watnee led the 490th into combat in June 1944. Airfields and coastal defenses in France were bombed immediately prior to and during the invasion of Normandy. With the end of the war, Colonel Watnee held a variety of senior positions while serving in Alaska, Florida, the Philippines, and California. He retired from active duty on November 30th, 1959. Colonel Watnee's love of aviation and communications paled in comparison with his love for his family. His older son, Lloyd Jr., had the same flying instincts as his dad. Lloyd Watnee Jr. picked up the nickname Jiggs because he was the first baby born to an officer of the 11th Bombardment Squadron, to which Lieutenant Watnee was assigned. The squadron's insignia was the popular cartoon character Jiggs, and the nickname stuck. Jiggs' younger brother Michael did not pursue a life of flying, but the brothers were the apple of their father's eye, and the colonel took every opportunity to let everyone know how deeply he loved them. In 1954, Colonel Watnee took great pride in pinning second lieutenant bars on Jiggs' shoulder. When Jiggs graduated from flight school, Colonel and Mrs. Watnee beamed with pride, knowing that the second generation of Watnee airmen had begun. After retiring from the Air Force, Colonel Watnee and Ruth moved to the quiet community of Neahkahnie near Nehalem on the Oregon coast. Watnee said the air there is fresh and clean, and the fish are always biting. He and Ruth remained active with family and friends and delighted in the company of their 8 grandchildren. When he reflected on a life very well spent, Colonel Watnee always spoke with grateful pride about the opportunity to serve the most wonderful country on earth, which he cherished until his death in June of 1976. Colonel Watnee Sr.'s service was so well regarded that the Air Force named a street on Scott Air Force Base in his honor and placed this monument there to immortalize his accomplishments. Colonel Lloyd H. Watnee Sr. was a true communications, airways, and air traffic services pioneer. When World War II began, he brought a major command organization from conception to full implementation in less than 18 months. He supervised the expansion of the airways network from 65 stations and 2,000 people to a global system of 800 stations and 50,000 people. He followed up these spectacular achievements by successfully leading a bomber group into air combat against Axis powers in the skies over France. As the first commander of AACS, reporting directly to Army Air Forces headquarters, he established air traffic control doctrine, policies, and procedures, and laid the foundation for the communications of today. In recognition of his lifetime of achievements in service to the United States Air Force, Colonel Lloyd H. Watnee Sr. is now being inducted into the Air Force Cyberspace Hall of Fame.